So why is the COVID inquiry identifying a toxic culture? Why does it use that particular phraseology? Why blame a culture in particular instead of the structure and process of government? And why use this metaphor toxic, which, by the way, has been used in other inquiries before? This is a question not asked anywhere else that I've seen. I've been complaining about this in British official inquiries for more than a decade. This toxic culture phrase comes up over and over again. So the COVID inquiry, just to remind you, it reported for the second time. This is the inquiry webpage, the landing page. It reported for the second time on Monday and focused on what went wrong. But instead of really getting into what went wrong, it went and focused on culture. So you get this huge report, and eventually on page 142, you get its recommendations, and there's this throwaway finding: there was a toxic and chaotic culture. What does toxic mean? It is not defined. Okay, so you might say, well, that was just casual language. Baroness Hallett here is in the habit of using. No, it's not. It's everywhere in British official inquiries. Now, this is why it matters. So, as I've noted in my textbook on security and risk management, there is in organizational design culture, structures, and processes, and you should analyze organizations in terms of all three things. If you don't, you are being negligent. So this inquiry, like British official inquiries in general, is being negligent because it's focusing on culture. But there's a motivated bias to do this, which I'll explain. That these inquiries are trying to avoid the structural and procedural mismanagement. They're trying to protect the system, and they're blaming a culture which is, if you blame a culture, it's so vague, you can't pin it on anybody except your enemies, and then you don't change the system in any structural or procedural way. And organizational design has to change all three things, or you don't get any meaningful change. So these inquiries are avoiding meaningful changes. So Baroness Hallett, I got nothing against her personally, but she is just woefully unqualified for this. She's a lawyer and a politician, and clearly doesn't know anything about science or about risk management. There is nothing in the report about risk management, by the way, even though she's supposed to be investigating how the government managed health risks in the COVID context in particular. There's nothing about risk management. Now, so that's excusable. She's a lawyer, except she's not interested in learning about any of those things. So she did not interview anybody, any expert on risk management or politics, to really understand what is going wrong in British government's handling of health risks. That's a choice, and it's inexcusable. Second inexcusable choice is she thoroughly manipulates the evidence to get to the conclusion she wants. She's an authoritarian. She wants to conclude or find. She wants to find. She has a motivated bias to find that the government did not lock down early enough, and it wasn't authoritarian enough, and the civil servants didn't take charge over the elected ministers early enough. And so she twists and selectively picks from the modeling in order to claim that 23,000 lives were lost just because lockdown wasn't imposed 1 week earlier than it really was. This is just abuse of the evidence. So she's not scientific. She's not a risk manager. She's also a bad lawyer because she's just twisting the evidence. In one sense, you could say she's a good lawyer. In the sophist sense, she's a sophist. She twists the evidence. So in that sense, she's a good lawyer. But she's not a good public servant. She's not a good inquiry leader. She is supposed to be getting to the facts. She's not. She spent nearly £200 million already, and she's not finished. She's only got to the second report. She's interviewed 166 witnesses, which do not include political scientists or risk management experts. She's published more than 1,000 pages, and yet they contain stupid phrases like toxic culture, which she doesn't explain. And then she cherry picks a few persons to blame, which is essentially four politicians and three politicians and a civil servant in national government, British national government. And then she equates these four people with a toxic and chaotic culture across national government, which employs more than 500,000 full-time civil servants and politicians. And yet these four people are supposed to define a culture for all 500 plus 500,000 plus in full-time employees of government. Just, that is an ignorant understanding of culture. This is where I think she's being ignorant rather than deliberately manipulative of the evidence. And then she's obsessed with culture as the problem here, and she doesn't identify structure and process. If it's not a motivated bias, it's she's following a habit, a norm in British official inquiries. And I promised to show you some of these examples. So here in 2013, these are just 4 examples from official inquiries into medical malpractice in the National Health Service, where babies die because they weren't taken care of properly, or old people are abused in NHS care. They dehydrate to death, etc. That's just the cases we know of. I've got another video. Go look at the Beast of Bethulia Park, where there's a brief discussion about reasons to believe that malpractice of these sorts is under observed. Anyway, here's the first case of toxic cocktail. Right. So Julie Mellor, she was then the Parliamentary Health Service Ombudsman, which we could have a whole discussion about why that's a quango, by the way, unaccountable to Parliament, except for its funding. Even though it says Parliamentary Health Service Ombudsman, we could have a whole discussion about the incompetence, the ineptitude, the unaccountability of oversight of the NHS. PHSO is one of dozens of quangos overseeing the NHS, and they just pass the buck to each other. And the PHSO is supposed to be the ultimate overseer, and it just avoids work. And I've written about this extensively. I don't want to get into it so much here. Anyway, 2013, she criticized the NHS for a toxic cocktail of a culture of defensiveness and a failure to listen to feedback. Toxic wasn't defined then, it never is. But what she was avoiding was the structural unaccountability from the NHS through all the quangos, the professional quangos, all the way up to the PHSO itself. So she identifies a culture, she protects herself. Because structurally, the system is at fault. It's unaccountable. And the procedural mistakes that are made within the NHS are because there's a lack of accountability. So there's lack of oversight. However well-motivated personnel are, lack of accountability leads to malpractice. But she's not going to talk about structure or process. She's going to identify toxic cocktail, culture of defensiveness. Later that same year, clinical professor completed a separate inquiry into safety within the NHS, and he recommended a zero harm culture. Doesn't healthcare already have a zero harm culture? Isn't that the Hippocratic oath? Do no harm. Oh no, but that's where he went. He added a legal duty for all healthcare workers to admit their mistakes. They already have that. And minimum staffing levels, they already have that. Again, ignoring structure and process to protect the system. So reaching for culture to protect the system, because culture, you can't imprison culture. You can't blame it on any particular person. All right, 2014, the then Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, because the malpractice went on, so he kept on getting more inquiries. Jeremy Hunt promised an open culture that learns from errors and corrects them. But he wanted an open culture that doesn't blame anyone. And he made the false analogy with the airline industry, as if the airline industry doesn't blame anyone. What he was trying to say was, he was trying to claim that the reason malpractice happens in the NHS is because people are afraid to speak up when errors start to be made. No, that's not the reason. That was blatant abuse of the evidence to protect the system. Again, culture's at fault. 2015, Parliament's Public Administration Select Committee, which, by the way, is the only committee that has oversight over the PHSO, primarily through its finances, but chooses not to hold the PHSO accountable for its procedural errors and its avoidance of work. The Public Administration Select Committee commended the Secretary of State, that is Jeremy Hunt, the one who said we need an open culture that learns from errors but doesn't blame anyone for them. That committee commended the Secretary of State's determination to tackle the culture of blame and defensiveness, right? So malpractice is because of a culture of blame and defensiveness. A procedural question, which is never admitted by the inquiry, and therefore it's never answered. Why was the government making decisions about lockdown without cost-benefit analysis? Even in the Treasury, which is supposed to specialize in risk management, including and cost benefit analysis, that sometimes they go together, but not always. The inquiry was told the government was making decisions about COVID without cost benefit analysis. So Cummings testified to the inquiry itself. There was never a full cost benefit analysis done on lockdowns, including the economic effects. This is true, but the Treasury could not and would not produce such analysis, even though, as I mentioned, it's not supposed to specialize in these things. By the way, Cummings, that quote is just left hanging. So the inquiry doesn't make use of that quote. It doesn't say, oh, well, one of our findings should be there should have been cost benefit analysis. It received that testimony. By the way, it received that testimony from Rishi Sunak, who was then Chancellor, i.e. in charge of the Treasury at the time. He said the same thing. I was surprised that there was no cost-benefit analysis. It's in the testimony, but it's not in the report. So the inquiry is being negligent here. It's ignoring a major finding. There was not cost-benefit analysis on decisions such as lockdown. That's a major finding. The Treasury is incompetent if it's not doing cost benefit analysis. And yet the inquiry just leaves this Cummings' one quote, only quotes Cummings, and it leaves it hanging. It doesn't use it towards a finding. Cummings only appears over and over again in this report, but it's just to criticize him primarily for this toxic culture. Look at this quote. Cummings materially contributed to the toxic and sexist workplace culture at the heart of UK government. He used offensive language. Well, that's a surprise for a special advisor. Maybe he was trying to get civil servants to do what they should have been doing. All right, so that was a procedural question. Why wasn't the government using cost-benefit analysis? Here's a structural question, which also is not asked by the inquiry. Should the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE, which is supposed to be advisory, it's supposed to be advising in private, should it have taken over policy making during the COVID emergency? Should it have been telling ministers what to do? And when ministers were pushing back, should it have selectively released official information? And should it have briefed against ministers who don't follow the science? Inquiry doesn't ask any of those questions. Now, I complained earlier that the inquiry portrays an annoying ignorance of risk management. Here's the evidence. In the report, the report is 500 pages long. It uses the word could, might, possibly, or possible over and over again. These are annoying words if you're a consumer of risk assessment because they don't mean anything. Almost anything is possible. If you say something is possible, it just means the probability is more than 0%. Right? An asteroid could and might destroy the Earth. Now what? What are you going to do with that assessment? It is impractical to make assessments like that. If she's saying you should have acted on anything that could or might have happened, the government would be doing everything beyond its resources. It would be pointless. You have to make choices and priorities. That's not the language she's using. The report uses the word risk 221 times. That might sound like she's mindful of the language of risk management, but she's using the word risk inappropriately to mean a possibility. Sometimes she appears to be using the word properly to mean the product of likelihood and outcome, but one can't be sure because she never defines or contextualizes anything. Now, a more precise word would be likely or probable or definitely. Definitely never work. It definitely is not in the report at all. Remember, it's more than 500 pages long. The probability is not used at all. The word unlikely is used just twice. The word likely is used 79 times. But some of the report's estimates of likely are based on already discredited models, such as the one that predicted higher casualties than actually turned out. And that's the model Baroness Hallett chooses to use to make an estimate of 23,000 unnecessary deaths because the lockdown, according to her, was imposed a week later than she wanted it to be. This report is a travesty, a waste of money, is a travesty for science, for risk management, and for jurisprudence.